Our next speaker is Vijay Prashad, and he is the George and Martha Kellner Chair of South Asian History and Professor and Director of the International Studies Program at Trinity College. His latest book is The Darker Nations, A People's History of the Third World. Two of his books, Karma of Brown Folk and Everybody Was Kung Fu Fighting, were chosen by the Village Voice as Books of the Year.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Van, and thanks, Margaret, for inviting me to be on a panel. I feel quite humbled to be here among you. This is, of course, an organization founded in anticipation of the war in Iraq, but as the war in Iraq was happening, we were already at war. Not just in Afghanistan, but at 182 places around the planet, where we have located our military in anticipation of escalating hostilities wherever we feel the need. But perhaps when we formed in 2003, we should have sent a better Arabic translator to Washington, D.C., because apparently Father Jami and Kanan Makia had forgotten that the sentences that the Iraqis were intoning then, they were not saying you'll be greeted with flowers, but you'll be greeted with shoes. So perhaps it might be a good idea to give them better Arabic translations. I'm going to be a bit of a damp squib, and although I agree that the door to hope has opened domestically, I think in terms of foreign policy and war policy, it is quite a different scenario. That the question of hope was on the table immediately on November 5th and right before then. But I think it seems to be narrowing once more. There is Gaza, there is relative silence. Now, the Bush administration's legacy would have cheered on the Israeli government and said, bomb them more, bomb them harder. The Obama administration, yes, a better line, we need to have a ceasefire. But yet the narrative is similar. So I'm going to talk a little bit against the idea of presidential time, to look at American history through the era of one president to the next, and suggest that even though we might be agreed on the personal stupidity of George Bush, that the continuities between, say, Carter onward are quite astounding on the level of foreign policy. That is to say, not domestic policy. So I would like to lay out a narrative of continuity against the question of presidential time. I'm going to rely a little bit on my book quickly to frame that story, and then I'm going to talk specifically about how I understand US foreign policy and then the possibilities before us in this period to come. The narrative first. In 1983, Fidel Castro, who I must say he must be thrilled. In Santiago just a few days ago, 50 years ago, he celebrated the revolution. Perhaps the singular most important revolution after the Second World War. Even much more important, I would say, than the Chinese Revolution. Such a disaster in the long term. But the Cuban Revolution, what a historical achievement, and so little recognized. The New York Times had the indecency, after Matthews's coverage at that time, to just report from Miami and to give no coverage from Havana or from Santiago, anywhere in Cuba. But nevertheless, in 1983, Castro comes to the non-aligned meeting in New Delhi and says that it is time now for all us countries, 170 plus countries, we are under attack from the International Monetary Fund. We are under attack from the advanced capitalist countries who are in the middle of a problem. They are entering a downslope. They are going to now try to get us into a debt crisis, he said. Mexico had already happened the previous year. He said, we are all going to go under. We need to have an international strike against debt servicing payments. We need to use our own value that we are creating out of our hard work to build our national infrastructures, to create mutual trade, and not to send debt servicing back to the advanced industrial countries to get them out of their slump that they are in the middle of. Of course, Castro lost the day. One of the great defeats in Castro's career was the non-aligned meeting in 1983, because that money that flooded from south to north helped provide an early bubble. which then enters the financialization structure, etc. It's a very long and complicated story, and I wish we had time to enter the discussion of the long-term trajectory of this financial crisis. It's not just deregulation in the US domestic scene, it's also the way international imperialism was restructured in the late 1970s and early 1980s. So that occurs. While this is occurring, many of these countries which had made commitments to their population, social democratic commitments, these countries reneged on their commitments in the 1980s. National, some cases revolutionary, some cases national democratic states lost their legitimacy. From the margins in each of these states comes the fires of fury. Political organizations which had been marginalized up to the 1980s, organizations whose primary identification was religion or ethnicity, etc., made a dramatic and important emergence in the 1980s. For instance, what we now call political Islam, or in India, the Hindutva movement, the right-wing Hindu movement, or indeed in Israel, when Likud for the first time comes to office in the late 1970s, having been marginalized by labor before then. The entry of the right, whose new shape is no longer in its cruel manifestation, but puts itself forward as the defender of the majority, either religion or ethnicity. These forces emerge. The United States' response to this is characteristic, and let's take the two ends of this spectrum. One, the Gulf, the other, Afghanistan. And it is true, as Alice Kessler Harris very importantly pointed out, that terrorism begins to be the word, the idea that replaces the Cold War or communism. But there's another word, which is oil. There are two important events that I want to put forward for our consideration from the late 1970s as these switches are occurring. Oil, the Carter Doctrine, enunciated in 1980, where Jimmy Carter essentially put forward the view that the security of Saudi Arabia was the security of the United States. It's a very important doctrine. It has had catastrophic effects for the Middle East and, of course, for the ability of the United States to be the so-called honest broker in the region. The Carter Doctrine. On the other end of that very large piece of land, on the other end, the United States, under Brzezinski's prodding and pushing, starts to help finance the far-right elements in Afghan society to fight against an internally combusting People's Democratic Revolution in Afghanistan. So people like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, for instance, who makes his reputation throwing acid in the face of women students at the University of Kabul in the engineering faculty, get funding from Brzezinski's minions to start a direct armed struggle against the People's Democratic Republic of Afghanistan. These are the two ends, these are the two responses. How to fight against this new globalized right? They select the military option. This begins in 1979 and 1980. Put that there. Now, I want to just lay out some implications from these and then come to the present era. You will have to guide me 2-3 minutes in advance. I would argue that between the 1970s and the present, there have been two separate, perhaps you might consider them tactical approaches, followed by the two major bourgeois parties in the United States. One is an approach which we might consider from the Bush-Cheney era of unilateral imperialism, where it's a go it alone, screw everybody else, we're going to do it. This was also there in Reagan. Screw everybody, we're going to do it. Bolton and those crowd, they fed on that doctrine in the Reagan administration. The United Nations is a hindrance, screw it. Let's just go and bomb, we can do it. Let's bomb Grenada, let's bomb in Beirut, let's just prop up, make really tight pals with the right wing in Israel, etc. That was one line. And the Republicans mainly supported that line, although, by the way, lots of friendly Democrats, including, of course, at the, what's his name, the mentor of Wolfowitz. Not Lieberman. Not Pearl. Scoop Jackson. Correct. Scoop Jackson. Sorry. How could I have forgotten his name? What a great name. Scoop Jackson. Friendly Democrats were there in Congress for this line. The second line is a multilateral imperialism. When they say multilateralism, in this section of the Democratic Party foreign policy elite, they don't mean you listen to what people in Palestine are saying. What they mean is Britain, Germany, France, all the old colonial powers, the members of the United Nations Security Council and themselves, as long as everybody listens to America. It's basically the American line, but all these former colonial powers have to tag along. This is what they mean by multilateralism. In a sense, it shuts out the 175 countries in the world. This is not genuine multilateralism. This is multilateral imperialism. Multilateral in name, but imperialism nonetheless. Still, there are some differences which I recognize. That's I think, the kind of tweedledee tweedledum that we see in foreign policy over this terrain. What are the ways in which US foreign policy has operated? One, we have to recognize the structural role played by the right in societies like, say, Egypt or Pakistan or India. Take Pakistan as an example. Pakistan undergoes IMF restructuring in the 1970s, around the time of the United States beginning to write a check to Pakistan regularly. You know, this checkbook thing starts in the 1950s. Tariq Ali recounts a wonderful story where Jinnah tries to rent his house to the American ambassador, who had the terrific name Allwine. But anyway, that kind of dalalism, what we call, the attempt of selling, petty merchanting yourself to the Americas had a long history. But nonetheless, from the 70s, Pakistan cuts its spending by IMF diktat on health and education. Well, once you cut health and education, you open the door for all kinds of faith-based organizations to come in and start providing health and education. And this is what indeed happens. In other words, the right plays a structural role in these societies. It is not some kind of entity that can just be taken out by bombs. It is now playing the role of genuinely the opium of the masses, not just ideologically, but also in fact in practical terms, because we have decided that health and education should not be a state function through the IMF. So we must understand that first point, the structural role played by the right in these societies. Anybody who thinks about Hamas, for instance, or Hezbollah and doesn't understand this is ignorant of the fundamental facts of the role of these organizations, or indeed Lashkar-e-Taiba, which just conducted the Mumbai attack. It's linked to healthcare provision. In Murdike, where they have the headquarters, they are the only healthcare provider in the area. It's very difficult for the Pakistani state to close them down. You close them down, there's a healthcare emergency. First thing, the structural role of these right-wing forces. Secondly, there was a failure to demobilize the jihad. I'm just now going to go to the Pakistani side. There's no time on the other way. After the 1980s war in Afghanistan, when the civil war began to slowly give itself out to the Taliban, many of the veterans of the Afghan jihad had the erroneous idea that they were the ones who won the war against the Soviets. So they then went home. They went to Chechnya. They went to the Philippines. They went to Egypt. They went to Saudi Arabia. And those from Pakistan went into the struggle in Kashmir. That struggle begins again in 1992 in earnest and is taken over by this section. They will base themselves. Lashkar-e-Taiba, for instance, is formed not in Pakistan but in the Kunar province of Afghanistan in 1991. The jihad was insufficiently demobilized. We have to understand that as well, that these are not some entities that have come from prehistory. If you take that whole section of the Pathan region of Afghanistan, it has a glorious history of non-religious activism, and it continues to. The Awami Party won the last election in that Waziristan area. And by the way, Bangladesh, Henry Kissinger's basket case. On New Year's, the greatest gift, the Awami Party swamped the election. It won, is the largest plurality in parliament. The Islamists won less than the Socialist Party in Bangladesh a few days ago. An incredible victory for secular forces in Bangladesh and in the borderlands of Pakistan in last year's election. These are things that are not seen. Obama talks about Pakistan. He's the first American president who can actually say Pakistan. But in the same sentence, he says, I want to bomb Pakistan. He's not understanding, the contradictions in these societies, that there are elements that can be pushed and promoted and brought forward, that you cannot complete this crisis if you don't understand the cause. We have to demobilize the jihad of the Afghan war. We have to go back and decontaminate that zone that we have created. That's the second thing. The third thing is Washington has consistently disregarded its own role by playing favorites in this process. One is our friend, another is our friend, and you see very quickly the friends Washington chooses are those without a mass base, or whose mass base, because they become friends, is quickly denuded. Fatah, super example. You have a mass base, suddenly Washington is your pal, Washington wants you to win an election, you're going to lose the election. Why? Because everybody understands Washington's structural role in their social maldevelopment. And we have to recognize that. So very quickly, my feeling is that we as historians need to be making this point over, because the bourgeois historians are going to say the era of Bush and Cheney is over. We are now in the era of Obama. Everything is great. Now we'll be greeted with flowers when we send more troops to Afghanistan. It is our role to say no. That this is a long-term trajectory. We have a long-term problem. We need to have long-term understandings of solutions, and that troops are not going to solve the problem. Troops are going to inflame the situation even more. Obama very cleverly and very disappointingly to me ran the election saying Afghanistan was the good war and Iraq was the wrong war. We cannot allow that to be doxa. We need to challenge that at every instance, and we need to demonstrate that Afghanistan is the long war, not the right war. Iraq is the wrong war. Afghanistan is the long war, and both need to be put a stop to. Thanks very much.